Good afternoon and welcome to The Power of Black Culture. I am joined by three wonderful guests today, two of which I know pretty damn well, and a third guest who I've been introduced to recently. I'd firstly like to thank everybody in our audience, either in person or online, for joining us for the Power of Festival in general. It's a really great way to celebrate Black identity in Britain and beyond, and the contributions that we continue to make. And for this panel in particular, I'd like to thank our partner, FARFETCH, for joining us in telling the stories of Black creatives. Without further ado, I will introduce, very briefly, I'm going to actually ask the panelists to introduce themselves a bit more, even though I'm throwing this on as a curveball now, but we've got Jeanie Annan Lewin, who is a super stylist and currently works at Perfect magazine. And we have Harris Elliott, who is the cool dude in the shades, but also has touch points across many different areas of the fashion and creative industry. And we're lastly joined by Tolu Coker, who is a menswear designer, or creative, or fashion designer in that sense, and also writes some really incredible pieces, most recently for The Guardian, which triggered people in the right way, shall I say, to actually get us thinking about what we're doing in the creative industry. But actually, I'm going to jump straight in and just say, for me, Black culture is about my ancestral past informing my present. And for each of you, I'd love to understand what Black culture represents for you. Tolu, if I can come to you first, please.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, there are so many cultures within Black culture, I think, first of all. And I think for me, it represents heritage, it represents identity, it represents freedom. I think especially as someone living in the diaspora, where I guess your culture is a culmination of so many different experiences, of so many different environments, I think having something that you're rooted in definitely kind of births a sense of identity.
Thank you. And Harris, coming to you.
For me, Black culture is about infinite possibilities. It's about the diaspora in its widest sense of the many different facets and groupings and cultures and languages within the diaspora, which is so vast, of which I don't even know an nth of, other than my heritage and that of my peers, and from those mainly in West Africa, or from my family from Jamaica. But starting to understand Black culture through the lens of that diaspora and how wide and vast it is tells me that actually there's an infinite future that's possible, because it stretches so far across continents, across language, across nuance, across reference. So, yeah.
Thank you. And then Jeanie, coming to you.
Gosh, I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. I think for me, it's kind of my heritage, lots of joy, pain, possibly, I don't know, sort of thinking about the future as well as the past altogether, if that makes sense. I guess it's looking at things through different lenses as well in terms of Black culture for me, because, you know, my identity and how I grew up is probably slightly different from somebody else's, and also realizing that there are certain things that unify us together in terms of obviously our skin color, but our sort of our upbringings are different, if that makes sense.
Completely. No, it does make sense. And I think what I take from all of your points is that Black identity is so multifaceted, and often we're put in a box to be one and the same.
Yeah.
And there are so many layers to who we are and to our culture, and especially with two of you in particular picking out the diaspora. And again, it's like Africa's not a small place, it's a continent. And actually there are so many other Black communities and places which don't get celebrated, and their stories don't get told in a wider lens. And I just think actually platforms and spaces like this is where we're hopefully here to celebrate.
Yeah.
But talking about that, it often feels as Black people that we're willed out for our mythical credibility in that sense, but never truly paid our dues. What is it, in your opinion, that brands want to market so much but not offer us a seat at the table for? Jeanie, coming to you.
what the reason why they do that.
Yeah, like why are brands in theory wheeling us out just for those moments, but not really seeing the true value as to what we can bring to the table as being part of the conversation?
Oh,
setting it up?
racism. Well,
Okay.
ding, ding, ding. I'm saying that because I feel like often people like to take parts of black culture, but they don't like black people. Make sense?
Yeah.
So people will spend a lot of time sort of taking the ideas of it. I don't know, examples, Elvis Presley. You know, the idea that I think I was 14 when I realized that rock and roll started from black people.
Yeah.
And that was a weird conversation I had with my dad, who was like, you really think Kurt Cobain came up with that by himself? And I was like, oh. You know, and then he sort of sat me down and brought out all of these record sleeves and sort of said, that's where that came from. But you know it as something else because you saw Elvis Presley on TV with it first.
Because of the way it's packaged.
Yeah. So it's you know, it's a tried and tested method. I'd like to think it's changing, but I think until I feel like I say this every week, but until systems changes, until we have people at the table kind of fighting for everybody's interests and not their own, we're going to be on this loop over and over again of people taking ideas and not involving the people whose ideas we're stealing from.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And Harris, coming to you.
Sometimes I think it's about a fear of people seeing the truth. So therefore, if we become the secret weapon, or elements of our culture becomes what can be shined, the light can be shined upon, then if we can then be put back into a box, then those who are being marketed to don't actually need to know the true real source. Right. So I think it's the idea that actually, if we then start revealing more and more of the truths, then we have to tell all facets of the story, and all of the stories are not that beautiful or not that credible and as a turgid and heinous past. So I think it suits brands and marketeers and ad agencies to share the elements that, be it the palm trees from Jamaica, or the elements that people want to associate with, the stereotyping of who we are, whereas to tell our real story becomes really uncomfortable. And I don't think a lot of people within media and marketing really often want to engage with uncomfortable truths, because then they have to look at themselves in that mirror.
Yeah, completely. Before I speak on that, Tolu.
Yeah, I think like both Jeanie and Harris touched on kind of my feelings, and I think the biggest thing, I think, especially when we're dealing with the idea of a brand, is that you have this almost myth of a system, this thing which exists that is outside the context of people. And when you just break it down and realize that people comprise that system, you realize that in, I guess, telling black stories, as Harris said, you've got to tell the entirety of it. And to tell the entirety of it is to take a part of responsibility. And I think there's a lot of personal work that needs to be done there. And when you get into kind of the circumstance of like a brand or an institution, it's really easy to hide behind bureaucracy. It's really easy to hide behind a system or a way of doing things which is difficult to change. But these rules are implemented by people. And so ultimately, I think it takes a lot of internal, personal work, and a lot of humility. Quite often when we're talking about, you know, kind of the fashion industry or the creative industries, we all know that there are hierarchies, and quite often for people to take responsibilities to say, I've got it wrong. And I think that can be a really difficult and humbling thing for someone to do.
So true. And I think a word, I do this often, but like a word I'd pull out from this, I guess, is palatability. That actually, it's how can we package things in a way that are palatable to a mass audience. But then I guess I've also experienced that in the workplace, because of the way that I speak, because of my name being Daniel Peters, because of the way that I dress. It allows me to fit into the mold of an organization that might be considered a luxury fashion business, for instance, because I present myself in a way, and it's not a fake presentation of who I am, it's an authentic representation, but in many ways, I'll be accepted into that space more so because people probably think I'm not going to ruffle feathers quite so much. Now I'm obviously slightly tired of that narrative. Like, I'll ruffle the feathers and I'll sing Beyonce. First Beyonce quote of the talk. But no, I think, again, it does kind of come back to that place of palatability and starting to break those molds. And Tolu, sticking with you, to look at your namesake brand, they feel so unapologetically Black. But as a Central St. Martin's graduate, were there times when you were encouraged to water down your aesthetic?
Yeah, I wouldn't even say it was just my aesthetic. I think it was my identity initially. So, disclaimer, my legal first name's Elizabeth, and I was kind of encouraged to use the name Elizabeth Coker because it sounded like a great brand name. But for me, Tolu, it means to God be the glory, and it's rooted in a huge story. It's rooted in my heritage. It's rooted in my parents' history and their parents' history. And so it was really important for me to kind of carry that on into what I'm doing. I think it's not, I wouldn't just say, it's Central St. Martin's. I think it's just generally, I guess, Western society. I found it in when I was working retail jobs, for example. It's that element of palatability that you were saying again. And I think it's also, I think it's an ignorant form of arrogance where people are accustomed to you assimilating. And so the minute you feel comfortable in your own skin, I think it took a lot of self-work to kind of be like, do you know what, it's okay to tell this story this way. Mm-hmm. And if I'm honest, I've definitely faced more challenges because of it, because I find that perhaps people don't understand how to market it or understand where to package it. Anything which tends to be in any way identified as Black also tends to be identified as niche. And I think it's really important to unlearn that. And I realized that actually, I think it's important to try and be the change that you want to see.
Yes.
And seeing my peers kind of jump on board the wave, and you kind of very organically grow this community of people who want to support you. I mean, Harris is one of them. Jeanie at FARFETCH, is doing amazing work. And I think that, that's the wave you've got to ride.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And Jeanie, for you as a Black creative, do you feel that you get to enjoy the same level of freedom as your white counterparts, for instance? And we've spoken about this very briefly.
And short answer is no. I think it's no for several reasons. I work in an industry that is, it's built on sort of playing on your insecurities. You are not good enough until you buy this, or wear this, or are part of this. And when you are somebody who is A, not sample size, and B, has very Black features, and is unashamedly absolutely fine with that. I quite like me. I just need everyone else to get on board.
They're coming.
Well, slowly but surely. But I've spent a lot of time throughout this industry just hearing sentences that are not sort of said to my white counterparts, and we all just sort of stand there really awkwardly, wondering when the tables are going to turn. I mean, I could reel out loads and loads of examples. I mean, the first job I got was because I have a double-barreled name and I have a very good telephone voice. So when I got to the Condé Nast offices, the 5'11" blonde they were looking for was in the shape of a 5'7", very round brown lady. And everyone just kind of had to deal with it because you couldn't send me home.
They're like, oh, but where's Jeanie?
And I was like, ta-da, here I am. Magic trick. I happened to be very good at my job, and that was what sort of led me to getting other jobs, and it was great. But I know had I gone for an interview first and they had seen me and not seen my CV and heard me, we would be talking about a different scenario, simple as that. And it's been like that. I've gone to the offices of very popular magazines, and you know how they're all set up with glass windows everywhere, and I could see the person looking at me, and I could see the realization coming on their face that the Jeanie that they have just read with the glowing resume that was highly recommended looks like this. And then it's a 40-minute conversation of them trying to get out of the things that they know are not true. Most of the time I'm overqualified for said jobs. For a long period of time, I kind of was applying for these fashion editor roles and I wouldn't get them. And it was always like, oh, you don't have the right experience. And you'd be like, no, I do. Here it is here. And then it'd be like, oh, no, maybe you've got too much experience. And you're like, oh, isn't that better? And then suddenly you're just like, why don't you just say you don't like black people and I could go?
Yeah.
And we could just half the time. Which is very strange. And whenever I say it, people are really shocked. But also, if you think about it for a minute, you're like, oh, okay. Because, I don't double up as a model. And if I did, probably I'd get a little bit further. But I'd only be able to get to a certain level. Now those things are changing in the industry, but it's hard, and it's disappointing because people think that representation only goes one way. So if we have lots of black models, then we've sort of solved the job. But we'll have lots of black models and we won't know how to do the model's hair because there's not enough black hairstylists. You'll have makeup artists putting on like foundation that's six shades too lighter because they don't know what they're doing. Because you've got makeup artists who can only do makeup one certain way. And until all of those things are addressed and discussed and organised, we're all going to be in this weird, awkward sort of position.
But it's interesting when you talk about makeup in that sense, because we look at somebody like Rihanna, who culturally changed the game by introducing shades of makeup that were more wholly universal. And that then encouraged other brands to look at what they weren't doing.
But they were able to change that with like a quickness that I didn't even understand.
It was done overnight.
Yeah.
As if the demand wasn't always there. But it took, I guess, a cultural pop provocateur to switch the narrative. But then she also did that with the lingerie.
Yeah.
And encouraged the likes of Victoria's Secret to become more size inclusive. But again, Rihanna snatched that crown. And I think, just as a person, she really embodies being a black person who is, yes, culturally relevant, but also moves the marker for a great deal of people. But then brands follow suit and ride on her coattails.
Yeah, of course they do. But they also follow suit because she's a palatable black woman.
She
looks a certain way. She looks a certain way. She gets a certain amount of money. That's like a surefire hit. So that's why she was in that position in the first place.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
If someone like Normali decided to launch a lingerie brand, I don't think it would be popping off, or a makeup brand as much, because she's a darker skinned woman.
No, it's
Which is
true.
a sad state of affairs. I hate saying shit like that. It feels taxing and it doesn't feel very fun having to point out the obvious. But that's it. But it's everybody's job who is in a position where they have some sort of privilege to be able to use that to benefit other people.
Yeah, and thankfully it's great to see that the lens and the narrative is being shifted and that we're moving towards a better place, but I guess that getting to that better place has taken so long, and we often have to start doing things ourselves to create that change and to create that shift, but we often do it with so less money behind us because we're not always backed. But switching to Harris for a second, just reading over your bio, I'm always drawn back to the statement, culture without compromise. And I'd just love for you to expand, firstly, on what that means to you, but then secondly, how do you authentically do this?
I use that term because within the terminology that a lot of us use as visual storytellers, and throughout my work, there's a lot of narrative and a lot of cultural narrative, and that's not specifically pertaining to different elements of black culture, although that does feature really heavily throughout my work. The idea that as I'm telling stories, it needs to be as nuanced and as true as possible. It can't be glossed over. So whether I'm telling my story or a story from the African diaspora, or whether I'm working with a Japanese client or whatever kind of client it might be, it's how do we get to the pivoting point, the inner sanctum, where that story radiates from. And so let's tell true cultural stories, because when I work with a lot of brands don't even really fully understand their own brand culture or know how to develop their own brand culture. So for me, it's like, well, can we look at whatever the brief is that you're suggesting, and let's tell it from the point of view that makes sense, that enables you to build a stronger culture, because from that culture, you build community, as Tolu was saying, and from that community, then you get some form of loyalty, and then you can create some form of movement. So for me, culture without compromise is about true stories that reference whatever cultural aspect narrative that I'm sharing.
So kind of, I guess then, authentic representation.
Yeah, authentic's not a word that I love, but yes, an overused euphemism within current marketing speak. But yeah, as true, authentic, as holistic, and unashamedly what it's supposed to be. Because so often it's putting that veneer on or presenting oneself a certain way in order to kind of become palatable. And like Jeanie and myself, I realised very early on when you step into these offices, the prejudice is really real. The amount of PR agencies I would walk into, even if I was turning up in a three-piece Tom Ford suit, they'd be saying, oh no, the courier office is around there. So it'd be that point where no matter what you look like, my pigment would step before whatever it is that I was wearing. So for me, it's like, how do I tell real strong stories that don't kind of scrimp on their authenticity?
Yeah, okay. No, I'm with you. And I will try to use the word authenticity less in that instance.
No, use it.
Just kind of switching the conversation to TV and the show I May Destroy You, which for me was such an incredible piece of work that really authentically showed Black people, but also other types of people who live in places like London. But again, going back to the Black perspective, it showed us in a true, see, I didn't use the word authentic, in a more true light there, to see us going to pubs and bars and going to restaurants and going to Ibiza and doing other bits and pieces. It felt like a true telling as to what modern Britain is. And so for me, it feels like it's a show that young people should be encouraged to watch. But for you growing up, what shows did you watch that made you feel your culture was well represented? Tolu, coming to you.
I watched everything. Like, I guess my experience was really different in that I went to a boarding school in West Sussex. So also what I was exposed to, so like what I watched growing up at home, I was watching Fresh Prince and Moesha. It was very much from kind of Americanized point of view and the Tyler Perry movies. So that's where visually I was kind of seeing Black people. And my dad, he was very much, very adamant about us knowing about not just our history, but history. I remember I watched Roots as a child, to give you context, which is pretty heavy. But then kind of going to boarding school, I was exposed to so many different things. And I think in that, I also began to see myself as an individual outside of Blackness. I think that's also important for the Black experience, is to recognize that you can see yourself in instances outside of people who don't just look, who have the same pigment as you. We're much more than our pigment, we're much more than this melanin. And so, yeah, I mean, even things like EastEnders, like, as trashy as that sounds, no disrespect to the EastEnders watchers, it was kind of almost like a culture of ours on Christmas Day where the family would gather around because you had the infamous Christmas special. And I think there's something to be said about that kind of element of, like, the Londony or the East End or kind of the working class that so many of us could relate to, even though we aren't the people that you would necessarily see on EastEnders. And so, yeah, I guess that was my experience.
But then I guess even with a show like EastEnders, and you're seeing a lot more on shows like Hollyoaks, like there's a lot more Black families, but Asian families and other families, there's a lot more representation. And even from an LGBTQIA perspective, it's kind of expanding on different stories so that there's not just one LGBTQIA person or couple, there's like 5, because actually that is reality. So I think it's really interesting that shows are starting to tap into who their audiences truly are. But Harris, what about you?
That really is a difficult question. I watched Roots as well, but didn't see myself in that at all. I didn't like to see myself in that as a child. But for me, from most of the TV experiences where I was able to identify, most of them happened to be American, because there were more Black people on American TV, but programs like Soul Train. And from here, the one program that stood out for me was The Real McCoy.
Oh my God, yes.
And in terms of being able to satirize and kind of put different aspects of black culture with the different characters and characterizations within that from those from back home that also come over here. That for me was the one program that I can stop and reference and say, actually, that made me feel, I felt myself and saw myself in that.
Actually, interesting. That reminds me of Desmond's.
That's what I was. That was
Like,
my one.
oh, did I steal it?
You stole
My
it.
bad. Sorry. Go on. Go on. You go first. I'll just hold, folks.
Yeah, basically it was Desmond's. I remember watching it and being like, that and The Real McCoy, and being like, oh look, that's like the family setup is very similar to my family setup as well. My dad is Jamaican, my mum is from West Africa, from Ghana. So it's that kind of like those clashing cultures, but they're very similar, but like almost like chalk and cheese sometimes. So there's just certain things that like we still in our sort of family to this day argue about that kind of make no sense, and it's because like some of us are leaning over to one side and some are to the other. But I remember seeing that. But then I also, I don't know, like I grew up with lots of Moesha. I just watched so many of those shows and would always identify with the black person because I was always the one black person in most social situations, which I was fully comfortable with because I didn't know anything else. Like we were the only black person on our street, a black family on our street. I went to a school where there was like 6 black people, so you know I've always just been sort of like bowling around by myself. But it does mean that you then, the things that I sort of grew up loving, like I loved hip hop, but then I was really into skating and I really liked Nirvana and Radiohead and I was really grungy, but I thought I was really authentic until I got older and met 15 people that were exactly like me. Like this, you know, it was like, oh, you're a black emo. And I was like, what is that? No, I thought I was really rare because I was really poetic and I liked Tupac. No, that's everybody. That's fucking everyone.
Yeah. Uniqueness is a bit of a myth.
It's such a myth. I used to have like blue extensions and I thought I was so like...
Oh my God, you did?
Yeah, and I had all of those colours and that's why everyone would, wherever I went in London, someone would be like, oh yeah, that's Jeanie. Not knowing that there's like 15 of me rolling around. And I'm not that special at all.
Let's not even talk about hair because I've had some choice hairstyles that I had a mohawk made of braids at one point,
Oh, wow.
so it all went into the middle. Yeah, that was a thing.
Special.
Don't try it at home, kids. It was special. Saw a Givenchy runway show and did like a bowl cut. Can you imagine a bowl cut on a black person?
That's a lot of maintenance.
Right?
So much.
Imagine relaxing
Yeah,
it.
humidity's going to fuck up your life.
See, the wow there said it all. Wow, yeah, I relaxed my hair.
Jermaine Stewart. Yeah.
And who did I take in a picture of to the hairdressers when I got my hair relaxed that time? David Beckham. I might as well have taken in a picture of Halle Berry at least. But I kind of stole your Desmond's moment, but Desmond's for me was a really pivotal show because it was also set in Peckham, I believe, and being born and bred Peckham, it felt really wonderful to see this black culture celebrated on TV and with Caribbean accents and people kissing their teeth. Not that that's all that we do, but it was this true telling of what black households can be like, and it felt really warm for me to kind of watch those experiences on TV. But moving to the next question, and thinking of our value and how it is measured, we still seem to live in a time where great works are snubbed whilst being globally celebrated like I May Destroy You. Are we in need of creating our own award shows in that way that BET created the network to tell our stories? Are we at that point of needing to do this when it comes to fashion, for instance, or, forgot the word I was about to say there, but you get where I'm going with it. Jeanie.
I always am quite against this because then you're not forcing people to be accountable, and I think people need to be fucking accountable. I don't think that I have to create a whole different thing to make myself comfortable because you can't understand something that I think is quite fucking simple. The same energy that we have for climate change and for sustainability, we should have for black bodies. That is not weird.
Yeah.
And I think that this ducking and weaving, I get it, but I also am just a bit like, we're not solving the problem. So like, yeah, I can go and do that. And every day I wake up and I think, yeah, maybe I just start a magazine that's just for black people, and then I don't have to deal with having to explain anything to anybody ever, and I'll have a peaceful life. I don't think it's solving the problem. I think it's insulating myself and keeping myself in the echo chamber that I like. That's my echo chamber with politics. Do you know what I mean? So I don't know anyone who votes Tory, because as soon as you tell me you do, we aren't friends anymore. I don't know if I can apply the same thing
Yeah, no, it's true.
to other aspects of my life, and I don't know if that's the best idea. I think it's better to cause conversation and to kind of force people to look within themselves and how they behave, because we're not going to get any change otherwise.
Yeah, completely agree.
So but it's an exhausting process, because it does make you feel like you have to be teacher all the time. Like, I'm a fashion stylist. I spend a lot of time talking about racism and not enough time styling, and sometimes that pisses me off. But I also know that if I don't do that, I'm not going to be able to do the job that I want to be able to do.
Yeah, completely. And Tolu, what about you?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because for me, I'm not against the idea at all, but I think it's less about creating the show, and I think it's the mentality behind creating your own space. I think quite often we still clamber for this idea of a seat at the table, and I think a lot of change has begun when people have kind of just been like, F it, like, I acknowledge what I do is amazing, and it's almost like you go where you're celebrated. And I think quite often so many people spend and waste so much incredible talent knocking on doors or trying to sit at tables or be invited to parties that quite simply they haven't been welcome to. And I think even now, as we're kind of seeing this shift and this change, even in kind of, like editors changing and creative directors, even when you look at like the history of music and every movement, it always started on the underground. And there's something which was so undeniable, and people were so dedicated, and they found so much value in what they were doing and were so consistent in it that the world had no choice but to eventually catch up. And I think that this is what you're having now, where you've got so many different collectives of young, black, melanated people coming together, connecting and saying, we're going to put this on. We think it's important to carry on doing what we're doing, even if we don't have this seal of approval to say it's good. I think the minute you wait for that seal of approval, it's so easy to be disheartened, because I think the reality of the situation is we're trying to make space and room in spaces and rooms that we were never initially intended to be in. So yeah, I think it's the mentality behind recognizing that we can if we want to. And if we do, it's important to support it and see value in that. And value in your creativity doesn't have to be measured by an accolade from spaces that don't acknowledge us. I think the more we start to not care so much, the more power we start to take back.
That's so true, but if anybody wants to give me an award, I'm totally here for it.
Yeah, that too.
But at the same time, I completely understand to that point that we shouldn't necessarily be chasing awards for a sense of credibility as a kind of marker. And, looking at existing companies and businesses who are creating change, for me, that's why it's so great to partner with FARFETCH on this panel, because actually they're an industry leader who are really encouraging growth within their own business, but also externally, and celebrating talent and people in different ways that doesn't always need to be done, on a stage at a fashion awards or something like that. It's actually bringing real people to a table to have honest and open and frank conversations across different marginalized communities, because we've seen a lot happen over the past 16 to 18 months for different communities, for Asian hate crimes and an increase in LGBT hate crimes and so on. So whilst a lot of this has been kicked off because of Black Lives Matter as a movement, really gaining a lot more momentum last year, I still think it's so important that we celebrate each other and one another. And I kind of went off on a tangent there, but here we are. I'm going to throw in a different question there, because I just recently finished watching Halston. I'm not sure if any of you have watched it. I quite liked it. I quite enjoyed it. But it also brought me back to that point of looking at black fashion icons. I've never really seen a TV show that celebrates any of them. And coming to you, Harris, who would you potentially want to see a show like that feature or spotlight?
I've never actually seen Halston, however it's pronounced, but from it would have to be Joe Casely-Hayford. Joe, such an amazing, rest in peace, Joe, amazing pioneer for design, true to his roots as a noble, elegant, avant-garde designer whose work was ripped off, and many times, and I spent a lot of time with the Casely-Hayford family and hearing a lot of the other stories about Joe's development from when he was at St Martin's in the late 70s right through to then when developing Casely-Hayford with his son Charlie, but how stories are back in the 80s where teams from the houses from Milan and Paris would be sent over to come and replicate what Joe Casely-Hayford was doing because he was so ahead of the curve. And for me, that isn't another designer that we've given birth to in this country that has come through our institutions, the most famous one being CSM, and had such an impact on global fashion that the house still produces their collections that are made in Japan. So that level of finish, and anyone who makes garments knows that the Japanese don't scrimp on anything, and they still have that kind of metric and that identity. So it would have to be Joe.
I mean, in that sense, he was a pioneer.
Yeah.
100%.
Like, he really drove the industry at a point where there were no black designers, really, especially in the UK. And I think, yeah, I've followed his work for a long time, and I love what he embodied. Jeanie, what about you?
Maybe not a designer, but someone like Andre Leontelli.
Yes.
Because I feel like he knows where all the bodies are buried. Like 100%.
Dear Anna.
He knows everything. And I kind of can't work out how somebody who is so loved is in the situations that he's in. Like, there was a GoFundMe for him at some point as well. But then he was doing like these massive campaigns for Uggs, and when you read his book, it feels like somebody who went in with intentions of going in, having a seat at the table, breaking the table and remaking it, and was never able to do that because he was outnumbered. And it would be quite nice to see that story be told.
Yeah, and it would be a fabulous story to tell.
Yeah.
Tolu, what about you?
Harris stole mine. mine was Joe as well, and I think I obviously I'd never had the pleasure of meeting him, but I think he left such a powerful legacy behind. And I think the thing that spoke to me most about his legacy probably wasn't even just the element of fashion. I think it was the cross-discipline and the commitment to culture, the commitment to presenting many cultures within what is so often viewed as a monolith. I think he really kind of shook a lot of that for those of us here, especially in the UK. And I think for that he deserves all the homage.
No, it's so true in that sense. And you know what, it's not, Harris, maybe don't steal other people's things next time. But I think, again, it's like, Andre Leontelli, completely get it, because actually that would be a dramatized version of his life. It would be very much Halston. Whereas actually I feel like for Joe Casely-Hayford, it's much more of a documentary and a telling of his process and narrating his story in that way, because the Halston story was so drama, so much about what went wrong. And I think that's what you'd kind of get with an Andre Leontelli. I realize that we're getting towards the end here, but last year's protests were without a doubt a catalyst for change. But has the fashion industry, for instance, made advancements to right its wrongs, in your opinion, especially when we think about cultural appropriation?
Oh, what, me?
Yeah,
No, I think we just put a Band-Aid over it. God, I'm such a negative Nelly, but it's true. Because I feel like I have conversations every day where people just aren't getting it. People they have an attention span to only get, okay, so be nicer to black people, and they leave it like that. And you're like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying, we have to we really have to think about everything, pull it apart, and build it back together. It's bigger than a reparation conversation. It's something long-lasting, and I think the fashion industry is just so kind of like, well, here's your more models, and like, you've got a job now, so it's fine. And it's like, yeah, but look how I got this job. I got this job by pointing out that there was systemic racism, and I wrote an article for Vogue, and that had traction. That is why I'm on this panel today, because I said something that I had been saying for years at dinner parties, that I couldn't get a job, but I was more qualified than everybody else that.
But then finally people listened to you, and it's like it took so long for people to finally listen to you, even though you were saying the same thing time and time again.
Like, it's the same thing over and over again, that we overlook people for these really weird reasons, and fashion is built in nepotism, and we have to figure that out. Like, you can't just kind of, it can't always just be someone's daughter that gets X, Y, Z. Like, if we have magazines full up with people's daughters who all dress in runway stuff, then we are telling the same story over and over again. What I'm saying is not revolutionary, it's just how it is. And I think the response is to let people talk more, but not do anything about it. So I spend a lot of time, talking and being part of committees and mentoring and stuff like that, but then I can't offer any solutions because the structural system is still the same. In order to get backing and to be bought in certain places, you need to come from a certain background or look a certain way or be palatable. Now, unless we change those things and stop moving the goalposts, we aren't going to be able to move on. But if everyone in your business is white, but you're still talking about wanting to be diverse, then you're not being diverse, are you? You're just talking about being diverse. So some actual action needs to happen, but I think that's also, this is coming alongside a global pandemic where people are sort of not getting jobs.
Yeah.
So I don't know how that's going to change.
But I'd say to that I don't think we'd necessarily be sat on the stage unless there had have been a pandemic.
No, of course not.
Because actually everybody was plugged into the same matrix at that point, and we actually were all listening and sharing stories and knowledge and seeking out knowledge. Like, I've had to learn a great deal in this past year about things I hadn't been taught, and I think that's been the same for some friends who I actually see in the audience, whereby we've all gone on a learning journey to push ourselves to the next point, and I'm finally seeing businesses and brands do the same thing. Using the word authentic again, Harris, but like, they're doing it authentically. It's they're going along this path and this journey. But I think, actually, we'll come back to that in a minute. Harris, what about you?
Kind of just picking up on your last point. As Black people, we were born in a pandemic. Things were always against us. Every time I stepped outside my house, up to today, to get onto, not literally today, but 2 weeks ago, I was at St. Martin's there as a guest lecturer. There was a woman walking in front of me. She could have been student, she could have been staff. She glimpsed me out the corner of her eye and she grasped her bag. And so the fact is, for everything that's been shared, that's been read, and for the talk of decolonizing curriculums and institutions, culture needs to change. And so if that's where we're teaching education, and that's where it's kind of starting, and for me, the education needs to start much younger. So before we even get into the fashion industry, we need to raise human beings that see others equal to themselves. And until we reach that point, the fashion industry is going to be having this conversation, which we've been having for years, the conversation about models, and then it was about size models, and then is it about Alec and Naomi back in the mid-90s, and this conversation isn't new. So as long as I've been in fashion and predating me, this conversation has been happening. It just so happens that George Floyd was murdered during the pandemic, why people started to understand that Black people have always been going through a pandemic. But until that happened, nobody was really taking note. Yeah. So I think culture needs to wake up and understand, or the institutions, as Jeannie says, the people that are employed, unless they're employing people who are at the boardroom, not just those that are creating the imagery or in front of the camera, until that change, then the rest of it just feels like a sham.
Yeah, completely. And Tolu, coming to you.
Yeah, I almost, in some ways, I actually think the conversation is a distraction. Like Harris said, like Jeannie said, this isn't revolutionary, this isn't new. It's not something which people are suddenly becoming enlightened of. That's a very, I think that kind of incapability, it's a very convenient narrative. Mm-hmm. People are more than capable of seeing that there's a problem, and there has been a problem for a long time. And I think I kind of go back to your first kind of question, which you posed to us, and I think that fundamentally there's a fear. There's a fear of allowing the people who have experienced these things to become the teacher and for others to become the students. So what you're going to see, kind of like Jeanie was saying, and as I'm sure Harris has probably experienced, is that you'll constantly be asked to be in a room, to sit on boards or committees where you actually have no power to change anything other than to give your experience or give potential suggestions, and then ultimately the decision is made by people who quite frankly don't understand how to steer the wheel. And as well as that, I think often where people kind of, clap and say there's been change or there have been differences, again, it's back to this thing that blackness isn't a monolith. You may see more black faces in certain spaces, but they don't represent the entirety of a community. One of the things I also want to draw on as well is that often it's not just about race. There's intersectionality.
Yeah.
You could be black and of a wealthy background, and sometimes money speaks faster than your skin color speaks, and that can become the voice of communities of people who perhaps come from a working class background and don't have the element of nepotism to help them get ahead. Mm-hmm. And I think that the people who are able to understand the different nuances of it are not the people who are leading the change. They're the voices that you'll see, that you'll hear perhaps, or that you'll see plastered on the covers of magazines. But when it comes to the infrastructure, to the decision making, to the allocations of budgets, it's almost as though the industry still, we're still at the same place, I think.
I mean, interestingly, I guess having pivoted my role to being more focused on diversity and inclusion in the past year, if I'd have launched that kind of company a year before, nobody would have listened. And not that it was something that I necessarily had thought about. It came to me last year in May after a bottle of wine. And I got to this point of looking at how are we inspiring a future generation of marginalized voices to enter into the fashion industry, but from a professional capacity, because for me, coming from corporate fashion, yes, I've very much only been the black or brown person in that space. So it's great to now have this operation that gets to speak to different businesses, but also, I guess, touching on what you guys have said, where it's like, where does that change then actually start to happen? And I guess I'm kind of starting to see it, and I'm working with organizations like the Fashion Council and being part of their committee. I think that's great because actually I'm looking at it from a different lens for them, and they're actually allowing me to be part of the conversation and steer things. So I'm glad that things are starting to make that change, but we do need the pace to catch up with the conversation because it's in completely different spaces in that sense. Before I ask my final question, I'd love to know if there are any questions from our audience. Don't feel pressured, it's fine if not. But if you do, please put your hand up. Silence. I can just sing if you want. Oh, please.
I hope that we'll get there. Whether or not we will is very difficult because I think, again, fashion does run on a lot of bureaucracy and quite often where individuals do have the power to say, actually, I can see here that perhaps I don't best know this and you know a lot of it. Quite often they hide behind the bureaucracy to say, well, it's not how it's done, we'll look into it, we'll review it, and it just tends to be something which is avoided. And I think people are more and more and increasingly beginning to realize this, beginning to realize that, perhaps the people who know a lot of the information, for example, fashion and education, people are constantly looking for consultants, and there are people who work in youth centres who have been bridging that gap between young people who are creative in council estates to getting into higher education. They'll never be called upon to sit in these spaces. Again, perhaps because they're not as palatable. I don't know exactly what those reasons are, but I think that there is a lot more that can be done that isn't being done. And I think there's fear behind that.
Thank you for the question. to the gentleman in the back.
What do you think about the whole thing of white people being allies in the black struggle? About white people being allies with black folks in our struggle?
Would anybody like to take that question?
Yeah. During this last year, I've had a lot of, we'll put friends in inverted commas, talk about being an ally, and then 5 seconds later, show me how they're not an ally. So you have lots of people buying books but not reading all of them, or reading it in a way that makes sense. So then you can have questions. We can have questions and there can be a dialogue, or you have people kind of thinking about things in this really narrow way, which I find really frustrating, because when I talk about equality, I mean equality across the board. I don't mean just it's not really about me. It's about people after me, people before me, or it's everybody. I think there are so many people who need to do so much work on themselves. Until you've done that work, you can't call yourself an ally. You can be understanding and sympathetic to a certain point of view, but until you're never going to be able to understand what my journey's like, because you don't live in my shoes. But you should be able to understand when I say to you, X affects me in this way, rather than kind of just asking me if I'm having a bad day, taking my word for it because I experienced it. And I think a lot of white people aren't able to do that properly. Mainly because I think if you don't understand that this system is out to rig us all, white people have been told that they are the blueprint for centuries. And that's not, and that's not because everyone's evil, that's because that's how it's been set up. Once you know that, you're able to move forward. But if you don't know that, then everything that me or any other person of colour says to you doesn't really make any sense, makes you confused, makes your head hurt, and then you end up digging your head in, burying your head in the sand and not dealing with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I wanted to actually quickly add something to that, and that's also understanding what allyship is, because I think it's been such a vague term that was used last year, and people kind of scrambling to show allegiance to something without understanding what it is to be an ally. And to be an ally to something is to be of service to something. And quite often the people who, and in many cases perhaps it is well intended, but it's that thing that Jeanie was saying, is that you could be so accustomed to being the blueprint that your form of allyship, or what you believe to be allyship, looks like asking on the surface questions because you've got your idea of how you're going to fix it, when really and truly you're not the teacher in that situation. You're there to kind of learn and to be of service. And I think for, like Jeanie said, it's a lot of self-work. It's not really just an institutional change, it's individuals changing and humbling themselves. I think that's where allyship starts.
Yeah. Harris, did you want to add anything to that, or?
It was eloquently put by both Jeanie and Tolu. I believe allyship can work, and we live in a country which is predominantly doesn't look like us. So therefore, for there to be development and living alongside and living together, their allyship has to work. Otherwise, repatriation is a must. So therefore, it can't be, I don't think it can be polarized to say that allyship can't work. It has to work. Otherwise, I'm jumping on the plane soon and taking myself out of here. So I believe it can work, and I believe it does work, but it doesn't necessarily come through the declaration of wearing a flag and saying, that's who I am. The allyship comes through your actions and through your deeds and through the prolonged life living. And for me, it comes back again to how people teach their children from a really young age. And if I was thinking about this last year in post everything that was going on, or during it while everything was going on, the idea that if you're raising your children and if they reach the age of 11, if they go to inner city schools where there's various different faiths and races, and if those children have never seen you bring, as white people, if they've never seen you bring home another nationality, one of their friends to come home for a play day or a sleepover, or their parents have never come round, by the time they get to secondary school and they start to assimilate to who looks most like me, who do I feel safe around, who have my parents ever hugged in the playground or in our home, it's only people that look like me, then I'm going to start just choosing my tribe, and my tribe looks like me during that point of puberty. And then I think a lot of those ills, those evils, and those well-intentions maybe, because your parents might still listen to Tapazuki or to Thelonious Monk, but at the same time it's about actually where is that real honesty and authentic behaviorism by allowing your children to play side by side and allow people into your lives. And in that way, allyship is kind of real.
Yeah, completely. Thank you very much for that question, sir. And I guess all I'd add to that is that I also have to be an ally as a black man to other marginalized communities and voices. The buck doesn't stop at that point. I think that we can't simply put the onus on white people to be allies, because in the midst of the Asian hate crimes, I then have to reciprocate that, because if not, it makes me a hypocrite, in my opinion, for me personally.
Agreed, but I think over the past few years, I think the media and different aspects within politics has started to divide the way that racially we look at and systemically how we look at society. Because growing up, seeing myself as an other, I saw all other races and faiths the same as me. I didn't separate black and brown people. That's become an acronymization, which has happened through the media and through institutions over the last number of years. For me, my Chinese friends, my Indian, Bangladeshi friends, my Turkish friends, they were all the same as me because they received the same kind of race hate or lack of opportunity within society as I did, so I didn't separate them. I think the media and society has separated us,
100%.
and so therefore I think it's a new kind of way that we share that, oh, actually, we mustn't like, that was just standard. I didn't ever see it, and as being an outsider, I was always looking in, so therefore whoever else was with me, we were always looking in, but I didn't necessarily look in to just be like that, so it's kind of, for me, I think the way I've raised my children and the way I was raised was that if you're on the outside, you're another. There's a camaraderie and it's just standard. It's just standard issue. It's not saying that I don't stand up for other groups. I do wholeheartedly. It's not saying that all lives matter. I'm just saying it's within my DNA anyway, because that's how I had to be raised.
No, completely agree. And I think to that point, coming from a working class family in Peckham, the people that I went to school with, as you say, were Turkish or Indian or from different backgrounds. So there wasn't ever really a question. But I think that sometimes the conversation can be sometimes misconstrued.
For sure.
In that sense. But as a final question, as a final thought, like I'm Jerry Springer, our secret sauce, and by our secret sauce I mean as black people and black culture, it can no longer be bottled and sold by others on our behalf in that sense. But how do we prepare future generations to be cultural change makers? Tolu?
I think it's leading by example. You can't, I feel like you can't teach what you don't embody. I'm a firm believer in that. I think that it's through your action. What you do speaks louder than what you say, and people are drawn to that. People look, if you think about anything you do, there's probably something or someone who has in some way embodied that before to give you, whether it's inspiration, whether it's, persistence when you're kind of feeling disheartened. And I think, we just have to be the example of what we want to see. I think as well as that, it also comes with sacrifice. This idea of being an idol, an icon can be really romanticized and seem amazing, but actually it takes a lot of sacrifice. It takes being the angry black woman or man in the room. It takes being disliked, actually. A lot of really empowering, revolutionary people were disliked in their time, and it's only in retrospect that people are able to look back and recognize what it was that they're doing. But it wasn't like that at the time. So, I think it's just being unapologetic and, embodying what the change you want to see.
No, I love that, and I think in some way it's about perhaps going against whatever grain might be there and carving out your own path, but not necessarily separately, but just, being able to stand proud and stand tall in who you are. And again, it's that sense of being unapologetic. Jeanie, have you got anything to add to that?
I mean, it's very much the same. I think it's just asking people questions and making people feel uncomfortable continuously, just as simple as that.
Let's get uncomfortable
together.
Like
I'm really fine with being uncomfortable, but rather than kind of being that person, I know that's very hard, but I have done this for a very long time, that when I feel uncomfortable about something, I say it. And I force those conversations because I don't think that you're able to grow otherwise. Otherwise, you're having the same argument within your space over and over again. Yeah. And I think if you're just in spaces where people, challenge people, if they say things that are out of pocket, that don't seem very progressive, that don't align with your beliefs or what they're supposed to be selling, then you're within your rights to challenge them. I think that's the only way. Because if enough of us say that something is out of order and isn't how it should be, then hopefully people will take notice of it. But if we all kind of, hide behind our shame and not say anything, then that's when things fester and they continue. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. And Harris, coming to you lastly.
Both those. Could you repeat the question for me, please?
So just in terms of our secret sauce as Black people and as Black cultural change makers, what can we kind of set up or say for younger generations who are coming up so that they feel as if they can carve out their own path as being cultural change makers or change makers in general?
I think a lot of it comes back to education and how we can inspire in both the ways that both Jeanie and Tolu have said, inspire by being unapologetically who we are, and by also not needing a seat at any particular table. And for me, that comes through how we start to teach what success means and what those definitions of success means. And so therefore, if our secret sauce means that we need to be seen in a certain elevated kind of position, and therefore we'll do whatever we can to get to that, we will use whatever methods and means to be there. But if success is taught as wholeness in self and wholeness in community, and by community I mean as racially, but also as humanity, teaching success as loving and respecting everyone around you, then as opposed to how much money you can earn or how much you can attain, then that for me is the way forward of actually knowing that succeeding in life is meaning that together we can do things stronger and be more empowered because we've been able to do that.
Yes, completely. And I'll just say to that, it's about being a community or a collective with all of the work that we're doing. And thank you so much for joining me on stage today. It's been really wonderful to speak to you all. Thank you to Tolu, to Harris, and to Jeanie. And also thank you to our partners, FARFETCH. Have a wonderful afternoon and see you soon.
Thank you.